Well, greetings, friends. The voice from behind the camera is Brad Jersak, and I'm here with my mentor, Ron Dart, who is also my supervisor and trail buddy, both in terms of some mountaineering we did together, and then the PhD I worked through with him on George Grant and Simone Weil. And I've asked if we could have a rambling conversation about some questions I have, and here's my intro. It seems to me that we have a real ideological war going on that's getting more extreme between progressives and conservatives. And what concerns me is about their amnesia, or what Ron will sometimes call memoricide, that conservatives have forgotten what it is they're trying to conserve, and that progressives, in their compassion and concern for the environment and race and gender issues in the 21st century, have forgotten their own roots and how disastrous those became. And so I want to look at a critique of both of those. So thanks for joining us, Ron.
Oh, welcome.
So let's start with conservatives. I don't think that when you use the word conservative, it has much to do with what I see on the far right in the American political spectrum, that there's an older and more beautiful conservatism. What is it that they were trying to conserve, and who are they in the first place?
Yeah, there's various types of conservatism. Some you'll get sort of one-trick ponies, say abortion is the issue, or one crop farmer in that sense, and they're trying to conserve what they see as the dignity of human life. On the other hand, there's a cluster of issues that some people see as conservative: traditional family values, euthanasia, crime and punishment, abortion issues, market economy. And so you can list these. It's like a jukebox. You put your money in and out comes the song. Same with the left for that matter. But the bigger question of what you mentioned is memoricide itself, is when someone says they're conservative beyond the particular issues that are more fruit on the tree. What's the trunk of the tree? What's the historic roots of the tree itself? So when you ask a conservative, what's the roots historically from which the trunk, the branches, the leaves, the fruit of your tree exist? What holds it up historically? Historically, many of them will, particularly in the American experience, they're conserving some element of an Anglo-American tradition. You're trying to conserve a break from church and state. It's the founding of the United States. Liberty is a key figure element of this, which is interesting. The early form of American conservatism, liberty in terms of religious freedom, contra what is seen as the oppressive nature of the European order, whether of England or France. So that's a form of conservatism that emerges in the Protestant Reformation, in fact, that it's about liberty from oppression. But they only want to go so far with their liberty. So at this point, it's usually liberty for denominations, various forms of denominations to spread, liberty of worship, liberty of the marketplace, usually some form of liberty from science, because science became a threat. So you'll often find people on the right, including a certain like a Donald Trump, or in Canada historically a Stephen Parr. You can't trust science, it's problematic. So liberty from the finds of science or medicine. And
was there political liberty too, like in terms of from empire, like not just from Vatican, but from the British Empire, whatever?
Absolutely. So the Puritan element that formed the United States was very much liberty from a form of the church they felt did not embody the authentic church. It was too tied in with the state, with power. And so the liberty of individuals to form and shape their own destiny. The state only existed to facilitate that for them. The Lockean, the contractual theory of the state, you get in Rousseau, you get in Locke, and people like that. So ironically enough, what goes by the name of conservatism is what we call historically first generation liberalism.
Right, liberty.
That's right. Liberty, equality, individuality, conscience, choice. The content issues of them they put on brakes at a certain point. So some is what we call liberalism today, or progressivism, is the adding on to that content and saying, well, what about the liberty of women in terms of so feminism emerges, and so you want to use liberty for freedom of religion, freedom of worship, freedom of the marketplace, freedom from science, freedom for private education. Well, now why can't women come along and say, well, what about our freedom in terms of being equality? So you bring liberty and equality, and then why do men get all the liberty and the women not quite as free?
And white men and white property owner men. And all
Absolutely. Well, that would be the second phase, obviously, that comes along. So not only the feminist issue, but then you get the racist issue. So what about the liberty of the blacks? So slaving, the whole slave trade, and then slaves in the South, which is part of, obviously, the American Civil War itself. And so the issue of liberty doesn't change at the level of principle. The content of it changes in terms of the social issues that's focused on. So not only, obviously, the blacks, and out of this you get the Civil War in attempting to end it in the States, as in England as well. But then you also get the liberty of the working class. So this is, of course, where you get 19th century movements. Karl Marx, obviously, the bourgeois, the proletariat, the working class versus the entrepreneurial class. They're just insisting you, first generation liberals, wanted freedom, but it's freedom just for select few. And we want that notion of liberty and individuality and equality to be expanded. That's what's often we call progressivism today, and moving the content of those principles ever forward. So we move into progressivism today. It's the liberty of LGBTQI, liberty of identity, the liberty of gender, the liberty of the whole notion of human nature. Is there any human nature at all other than what we choose to make it as? So we are socialized conditions, and at a certain point we use our liberty, all being equal in good conscience. So what the early reformers saw, the Bible was the source of authority, and they used their liberty to interpret it. They can never agree. That's where you get the denominations. So you take that text away as a source of authority. The new authority, really, the sacred text, is my identity, my sense of who I am. And I can interpret that any way I see fit. So that's just the secularization of the Protestant principle, really. And so the principles of liberalism have not really changed. The application of those principles from first generation liberalism, who wanted to put brakes on it, they're now called conservatives.
Right, so the conservative is the one who is the liberal, American liberal, who is putting the brakes on after the first generation.
That's right.
To this day in some way. Is there a conservatism then that predates American French revolutions? Like, so what would be the conservatism? What's the thing we're conserving, let's say, in the Commonwealth? And probably listeners even need a definition of Commonwealth now too. What commonweal and all of that. Isn't that a kind of older conservatism?
It's the whole notion of the commonweal or the commonwealth or the common good, that we are knit together as people and we share a responsibility for one another, not only at the level of the state but the level of society. And that's a middle way between, on the one hand, collectivism on the left, which is Marxism's just a form of liberalism on the left, really. He believed that none would have liberty until all had liberty in the Hegelian dialectic of history. And so Marx is just leftist liberalism, taking Hegel's notion of the dialectic of history in the level of idea and applying it to the level of economics, arguing that but liberty was really foundational and equality was foundational to Marx in that sense. So he was just a leftist liberal, and social liberalism is just that as well. And so what they do is they parasite off an old notion of the common good. And so classical conservatism very much is concerned with the common good and personhood versus the extremes of individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other hand. And it's living in this tension. But Plato, if you ask many conservatives today how well they know Plato or Aristotle or Cicero or Seneca or the patristic tradition in Christianity and the mothers and fathers of the Church of the Orthodox Roman Catholic tradition, the medieval ethos of the West, of the East, Byzantium, there's just nothing going on in their head. That's Memoricide. So what they're conserving is a certain point of history of the birth or midwifing of liberalism itself as an ideology. And so when you hear the word conservative, you want to say, so what period of history are you conserving, and what principles are you conserving, and how far you allow those principles to work themselves out before you put brakes on them?
Right. So you've got these people that we would say are far right, who call themselves the Tea Party. And what are they conserving? They're conserving in a moment in history of revolt against, well, they would say taxation without representation, but we might also say that they were revolting against the commonweal. That, well, why should we worry about, yes, there was probably injustice there, but it just strikes me that a far right group would be called the Tea Party, when in fact there's this conservatism that predates all of that, and that now you sometimes call that the high Tory tradition, don't you?
Yeah, so there is a form, people sometimes confuse or they equate Toryism with conservatism.
Right.
It's very interesting. If we had time, we could reflect on, for example, John Locke in the Second Treatise of Government. He's constantly quoting from Hooker, Hooker's Laws of Ecclesiastical Polity. But he's misquoting Hooker again and again. And Hooker embodies a way of understanding the common good or the common weal, and the role of state and society in doing that is not as contractual in the way Locke or Rousseau would have it be. And a high role of the state in Hooker in terms of embodying and bringing into being with society or the parish, in that sense, the common good. Now, many conservatives see the state as often the problem in terms of in a society, or the individual is the key thing. And so this is where a Hooker or an Erasmus or a Thomas More or many late sort of medieval political theorists or philosophers, this notion somehow the state is the problem, other than for sort of a strong military to protect you from being killed, or police force for law and order from within. But when it comes to other than that, people should have the freedom to do what they want in the economic sphere, in the religious sphere, in the educational sphere, the ecological sphere. Business can do what it wants in the environment as long as profit is the key thing. I might just say also, this was another big thing in the 19th century, the rise of why is it just the freedom of persons? What about the freedom of the environment to be treated properly? Well, the whole environmental movement of the 19th century was a movement, goes back earlier than that, the important...
the Lake Poets? And
yeah,
so
definitely. Coleridge, Wordsworth, Southey. I mean, 1798 was lyrical ballads. This was a great breakthrough work in terms of working with the working class people, the environmental issues, the common good, and of course just right across in northeast England was the factories, Birmingham, Manchester, belching out their pollution. And so it's this high Toryism that also brings together nature and humans as well in the relationship. It's a triangle: God, humanity, and nature. And so these... And
so it's the foundation of the Green movement really was a conservative high Tory.
Yeah, and all of them were Anglicans. So when we think, for example, in Canada, the last head of the Green Party, Elizabeth May, was Anglican. She's on the shoulders of people like Coleridge and Wordsworth and Southey and lyrical ballads of 1798. And then of course they're building on something too. They're not working in a vacuum. And so when you get people on the right who are not ecological, but they claim to be conservative, you say, well, that has nothing to do with conservatism. You're just pandering to liberty equals entrepreneurialism, and the impact of that on the physical environment and then on people as a result. So
they're, in that sense, not conservationists, right? Though claiming to be conservative, it's a kind of radical liberal... in the sense of, I'll do what I want with my business, with my smokestacks, and so on. So just one other question before we move over to the progressives. So in terms of Canada, from a Canadian viewpoint, the fact that I do believe that it's a wonderful blessing to have health care for all, that's not so much a far left socialist identity. That's saying I'd like to conserve this idea of a common good where we come together for the benefit of others. Am I on track there though, or am I mistaken? Am I just a Marxist or something if I believe in universal health care?
No, I mean that's just a foundation of a basically civilized society. That the common good, and I mean, people aren't in good health, and then they don't have the money to go to the hospital or pay to a doctor, and the implications of that, and only society's responsible for that, or grassroots up. That misunderstands the role of citizens in a society to care for one another from ocean to ocean. I would also argue education should be essentially free as well. And students coming along, obviously you don't want to have them go into debt, and then of course the banks live off that with interest, whereas if you have people can move through their university free, they get the point, you know, in their 30s, 40s, they're paying higher taxes to assist the next generation coming along. And there's all sorts of things the role of the state can do with citizens who have a sense of just not their individual liberty, their freedom to either get health care or not, their freedom to afford university or not, but recognizing we are knit together. And that's a basic Tory classical conservative perspective.
That we're knit together.
We're knit together, past, present, and future, and we're responsible for one another, and both state and society are a very, very important role in that. That's not a leftist idea. That's the notion of the organic nature of, it goes back to Plato, Aristotle, early Christian thinking, the patristic writers. There's nothing, but I think we're back to Memoricide. People think if you're for a strong state and higher taxes, or a state intervening in the economy, and just you must be leftist. Well, those ideas antedate Marx. They antedate Fabianism or social liberalism or welfare liberalism.
You're not just Bernie Sanders then. You sound like, you know, the old progressive conservative, almost a Diefenbaker